Thanks, Chris. Appreciate your having me. I recognize so many of your bylines from my own following of what's going on in your state capital. So pleasure to be with you. There's an awful lot happening in our politics, and I know that politics reporters are more stretched than ever, given the news cycle, given the reality and the demands of today's profession. I want to make a case that even in the middle of a pandemic and vaccinations and stretched state budgets, and one of the most important things you will cover this year is, in fact, redistricting. It's not an easy story to cover. A lot of it happens behind closed doors. It involves maps and math that can seem dull to a lot of people, maybe even to your editors, but it will define the playing field of your state's politics, the kinds of policies that emerge for the next decade. Redistricting is one of the most powerful structural forces in American politics, and by many measures, the gerrymandering that is taking place now is worse than it ever has been in our country's history. The Supreme Court has withdrawn from this debate in 2019. They ruled it was a non-justiciable political issue. And so there's going to be the potential for a real free-for-all in state legislatures around the country. At the national level, I think that new maps that are drawn this year make it very possible that the exact same distribution of votes that you saw in 2020 for the US House would produce a different outcome, Speaker Kevin McCarthy and not Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And the events that will shape these lines, they're underway right now. The census numbers, as you've been reading today and hearing today, are probably likely not to come out until September. So the actual line drawing won't begin in earnest until then, but behind the scenes, the machinations are well underway. And in many cases, these lawmakers are already right now trying to keep their redistricting process under wraps, make it harder for you to get the information that you need. I do think that there are a lot of ways to make this real, that there's really nothing boring about this at all, that redistricting touches on not only every political issue, but it really determines whether a majority of citizens have the ability to change their government, whether politicians can pursue their agendas insulated from voters. It's about the leaders who might be empowered, the voters who might be disenfranchised. Race and the kind of democracy that we will be is often at the heart of these questions. It's about who holds political power and what it is we mean when we talk about the very question of representation. I think that in many ways, voters and we in the media are just now catching up with the importance of redistricting and how it has changed in the last decade because of growth in technology and big data, political polarization, and how all of that in turn has made it possible for politicians to weaponize redistricting for blunt force political gain that, as we've seen over the course of this last decade, can be almost impossible to undo at the ballot box for many, many years. That blunt force political weapon, that's when redistricting becomes gerrymandering, the art and science of using these district lines to lock in power and disadvantage the other side. Two main ways of doing that involve cracking and packing. Packing, meaning you take as many of the other side's voters and you stuff them into one or two districts that they win overwhelmingly, making them less represented in all the surrounding districts, and cracking when you simply dilute them and spread them across as many districts as possible and make it hard to win a majority in very many of them at all. We're talking about behavior and actions of political parties and describing partisan implications of this, but this is really about power, not always about partisanship. Certainly Democrats drew such wild gerrymanders back in the 1980s that the congressman with the pen liked to refer to them as his contribution to modern art. But something has happened, and this is really what I've been writing about over the course of the last many years, is that in 2010 and 2011, there is a qualitative and quantitative difference in the way that politicians gerrymander. That today's gerrymanders are no longer the ones named after Elbridge Gerry, the poor Massachusetts governor this is named after from the 1810s. and that indeed they aren't even the gerrymanders of the early 2000s. The gerrymanders, academics have found that the maps that were drawn in 2011 were 3 times as partisan as the maps that were drawn in 2001. And it's because these extreme gerrymanders today, they involve these terabytes of voter data and sophisticated geographic information system mapping software, supercomputers. Politicians are able to be better and faster at gerrymandering than ever because of these powerful computers, because of this precise data, because voting patterns are easier to predict in this era of partisan polarization. They have the tools and the determination to do, unfortunately, a better job at this than ever before. So let me talk a little bit about the 2010 cycle, about how I came onto the story, what I've seen on the democracy beat. Could talk a little bit about the stories of what happened in some of these states, some of them your states, and to maybe talk about some strategies for covering this yourself. Really, I was editor-in-chief of Salon in 2013, and we were looking. The big story in our politics in many ways was what was happening in the US House, the 4 dozen votes on Obamacare, the government shutdowns that emerged out of that. And I asked a simple question. I simply said, why didn't Democrats take back the House in 2012 when Obama was reelected, 332 electoral votes, 4.9 million popular vote margin? Democrats gained 2 seats in the US Senate that year, but Republicans held a 234-201 edge in Congress regardless. It turns out, as I looked at it, that Democrats won the national popular vote for the US House by 1.4 million votes that year. We don't elect the House by national popular vote or much of anything. But as I looked at the state delegations, I was kind of amazed. Pennsylvania had a 13-5 Republican delegation. Ohio was 12-4. Michigan was 9-5. North Carolina 9-4. It seemed a little out of whack to the actual populations of those states. And it came back into work and said to, Steve Kornacki and Joan Walsh and all these smart people at the time, and said, we ought to write about this. And they kind of looked at me as, gerrymandering. It was as if I was kind of a flat earther, because at the time, the theory in vogue was the big sort, that, the Democrats had gerrymandered themselves in many ways, that they simply chose to live in big cities and Republicans were more efficiently spread out. The Democrats had sort of naturally packed themselves. Indeed, if you look at the New York Times, they didn't have any mention of this Republican strategy to do this, not in 2009, not in 2010, not in 2011. It simply wasn't being covered. And what I found as I went back was this amazing Karl Rove op-ed from the Wall Street Journal in March of 2010 that laid out that the Republicans had a strategy called the Redistricting a Majority Project. And really, you can credit a really smart strategist named Chris Jankowski with this idea. He kind of understands that elections in years ending in 0 mean more, that they can reverberate for a decade. And he grasps that it's controlling state legislatures that's the key to unlocking this entire big picture nationwide. In about 80% of all states at the time, it was the state legislature that drew not only the congressional map, but their own maps. So his strategy, it's pretty simple, it's pretty elegant. You target those relatively inexpensive state house and Senate chambers with the goal of flipping them in your direction, controlling redistricting in as many states as possible, all the seats at the table. Draw yourselves friendly districts that lock in those gains for the next 10 years. It's Moneyball, right? If you read the Michael Lewis book, you are looking to find the bargain that everyone else overlooked. And in these cases, it is state legislatures. The Rove op-ed is kind of amazing to read. You can go back. What he writes is that some of the most important contests this fall will be way down the ballot in communities like Portsmouth, Ohio, and West Lafayette, Indiana, neighborhoods like Brushy Creek in Round Rock, Texas, and Murraysville Township in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. These are state legislative races that will determine who redraws congressional district lines after this year's census, a process that could determine which party controls upwards of 20 seats and whether many other seats will be competitive. We stumbled across, not long after that, the website that the Republicans made for the Redistricting Majority Project, and you can read their annual reports, and they had taken credit for the lines that were drawn in 2011 as providing the firewall that allowed them to retain the House. They claimed that those results had been essentially foreordained. And this, I thought, was a pretty telling paragraph. REDMAP's effect on the 2012 election is plain when analyzing the results. Pennsylvanians cast 83,000 more votes for Democratic U.S. House candidates than their Republican opponents, but elected a 13-5 Republican majority. Michiganders cast over 240,000 more votes for Democratic congressional candidates and Republicans, but still elected a 9-5 Republican delegation. Nationwide, Republicans won 54% of the U.S. House seats, along with 58 of 99 state legislative chambers, while winning only 8 of 33 U.S. Senate races and carrying only 47.8 of the national popular vote. That's not me talking about the importance of redistricting in these lines. It's the Republicans who drew them. So there was nothing accidental about what happened in the House in 2012. It was a strategy to quietly dump millions into the 2010 state legislative elections to catch Democrats off guard, empower Republicans to use this hyper-precise data to draw congressional and legislative maps that benefited their candidates over the course of the next decade. In Unrigged, I spent some time talking with Eric Holder, who's been running the Democrats' attempts to come back from this. And I asked him when he had first heard of REDMAP, and he said that for him, it came down to this night not long after the 2012 election, and he said he and Obama were outside the Oval Office and they were reviewing the election numbers and they were utterly bewildered. And what he said to me is, we thought we had done well in terms of the raw vote, but it wasn't at all reflected in the number of representatives that we had at the state and federal level. So what's going on? REDMAP had been this small part of my consciousness. I'd heard the phrase, but it wasn't anything I had focused on. And then we saw the election results. And those results have really endured over the course of all this time. REDMAP in many ways, I think, is the greatest political heist and bargain in modern American history. So what I did is I used the Rove op-ed and the website. There were 107 key state legislative races that Republicans targeted in 16 states. So I went and visited these lawmakers. I heard their stories, found some lawsuits that were underway over redistricting in Florida and Wisconsin. And then finally emailed the architects of this campaign and asked to talk, and they were proud of what they'd done. They'd remade American politics in many ways, and almost no one had noticed. So they were even willing to talk to the editor of Salon. And it's kind of amazing what happens the year after the 2010 elections. You know, state after state, these stories unfold in really similar ways as Republicans claim the spoils of their big electoral wins in 2011. And I went back to try to connect the dots of what happens, and it was probably easier for me to recreate than it is to cover all this in real time. But I tell these stories because I think they're the talks that are underway right now in your state capitals. And you'll want to be thinking through stories and strategies to kind of bring all this to light. A map really is a piece of legislation, and there's a process behind its creation. There are people who have seats at the table, people who don't, and sunlight and transparency laws you might be able to use. In Ohio, you had Republican strategists who barricaded themselves into a suite at the Doubletree Hotel across from the Capitol, and they actually called it the bunker. And they tried to keep themselves private and secret over there, as together with national strategists, they devised these new districts with very serious mathematical algorithms based on partisan voting patterns. And when you review their emails, you can see the private meetings at the secret locations and the personal email use for state business and exchanges showing last-minute changes to the maps with an eye to campaign contributions. It's similar in Florida, where days after the 2010 election, in which voters had overwhelmingly backed 2 constitutional amendments there that prohibited partisan gerrymandering, you had some of the savviest consultants in the state gathering and trying to plot an end run around this. And what they did was they drew all their maps in private. They had all their fancy consultants and their mathematicians work these maps up. And then they used the public process and they funneled those secret consultant drawn maps into the public process. And they pretended that they were simply public contributions, and they created phony email addresses under the names of their former college interns, or they would use their spouse's name or their neighbor's name as they emailed in these hyper partisan maps that in many cases became the actual congressional and legislative districts in Florida. You can see it in Michigan. You can see it in Wisconsin. It's really similar stories in many of these states, and I'm happy to talk about any of the individual ones if anybody would like. Certainly, the purpose of a gerrymander is to create a map that is unresponsive to a political shift in the electorate, and I would say that really is what it has done. After the 2018 election, there were 59 million Americans who live in a state in which one or both chambers of the state legislature is controlled by the party that won fewer votes statewide that year. That's about 1 in 6 of us. There's a lot of ways that you can show this. You can show it by driving the streets. I went out and drove a lot of these districts in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, and it's really amazing how these maps that look so insane when you look at them, and then you get to street level and you kind of take the turns and you see how perfectly they correspond to economics and demographics. You can take 3 left turns in Detroit along Michigan's 14th district, and you come in and out of the district 3 times. It's been gerrymandered to pack the poorest African-American neighborhoods there with the city of Pontiac 35 miles north. And what happens is you just watch the property values deflate from over $500,000 to $8,500 as this happens. You know, it's a similar story in Pennsylvania as you drive across the 6th and the 7th and the 13th around Norristown or King of Prussia. All of this has simply happened simply and intentionally and by design. There are local impacts of all of this on policy. It's not just state legislatures that are often gerrymandered. It can be county commissions, school boards, all of this. I want to skip across some of this. But there's big national trends that are clear and visible through all of this that we can talk about. Mark Meadows, for example, really in many ways wins his seat in Congress because of redistricting. That is a district in North Carolina that did not exist prior to the lines being drawn in that way. You draw a line across Asheville in North Carolina out in the western part of the states. It's a very Democratic city in a very Republican area. You crack it in half, you spread the Democrats across 2 different districts, and suddenly you are electing different kinds of members of Congress that change our politics at the local and at the national level in deep and serious ways. The good news here is that you can also show this through that the very technology that makes it possible to draw these maps also makes it possible to see through what has been done, and that there are groups, many of them in your states, that want to help, that can test these maps. In Pennsylvania, you had a lawsuit and the state Supreme Court overturned that congressional map that was gerrymandered in 2018. The map went back to the legislature for another crack, and they offered up a new version that had fewer wild and crazy shapes and that split fewer counties and towns. But the governor wasn't so sure that it was going to be a fair map. He didn't trust them, so he called up Moon Duchin, a mathematician at Tufts, to test it. And she was able to do a computer simulation, and she created, over the course of 5 days, 3 billion random districts and maps out of Pennsylvania. And she was able to compare the partisanship of the map that was drawn by the legislature to a suite of 3 billion possible alternatives. And what she found was that the new map was every bit as partisan as the old one. And so the court rejected it, and they turned it over to a special master to draw instead. And they ended up with a map that very quickly drew a 9-9, a delegation about what you would imagine Pennsylvania would bring about. I think more good news is that voters care about this. You have seen initiatives driven by voters in red states, in blue states, in purple states that have been very successful across party lines at trying to bring more fairness. The bad news is that there's going to be more partisan pressure on these maps than ever before. You already see New York's Democratic majority attempting to pass a law that will allow them to mess with the work of the commission that draws the lines there. You've got Republicans in Arizona who have been attempting to interfere with the appointment of the chair of the Independent Redistricting Commission there. You've seen in North Dakota, just in the last couple of days, efforts to change the transparency laws around redistricting. This, in many ways, it's at the heart of our watchdog role. The integrity of these maps determines the fairness of our politics. Oftentimes, it can be a life or death issue. This is about basic equity. It's about the meaning of representation, but the kind of democracy we have. I think it can be a context for a lot of the other stories that you will tell over the course of many years. Thanks.
All right, Dave. So we, if you guys have a question, raise your hand. And when you go to the Q&A, do me a favor and give David your name and your news outlet. I do have a question here in the chat from Laura Schulte of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Do redistricting commissions tend to keep gerrymandering from being as severe?
Yes, is the short answer. When you tend to have the most extreme maps when one party is able to dominate the entire process from start to finish. So when Democrats draw the lines in Maryland, you end up with a 7-1 map and 88% of the seats in a state where that has a very popular Republican governor. When Republicans have the power to draw all of the seats in, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Ohio, Wisconsin, you again see one-sided maps. Now commissions, some of them work better than others. It depends on the rules that they're given, on the criteria that they use, on the way that the members are appointed. Ohio has a commission, but it's a commission essentially of lawmakers. The Arizona Commission as well is mostly appointed by politicians and partisans. The commissions in Washington State and New Jersey often produce what's called buddy manders, in which the politicians get together and essentially just hand themselves safe districts. The California Commission is probably considered the gold standard of all of this. 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 4 independents, and they have to produce a map that wins supermajority support from all 3 groups, and they have to really show their work and justify it. The new commission in Michigan is modeled after that. The new commission in Virginia is half citizens and half lawmakers. We'll see how that works. But I mean, commissions tend to be a little bit better. Certainly, they are more transparent and public than lawmakers doing this behind the scenes.
Okay, so let's go to questions first from Lauren Gibbons.
Hi, David. Good to see you again. I know we talked quite a bit during the Voters Not Politicians, but yeah. So most of my and MLive's reporting more generally so far this year has kind of been reintroducing the concept, what the commission is supposed to be, and just kind of explaining to people what some of the tenets are. But in terms of Watchdog reporting, as you said, what are some of the things that reporters in Michigan should be looking out for with this new system to ensure that it's working appropriately?
I think it would be really interesting to take a look at where commissions tend to fail and where partisans try to influence them. If you go back, there's a terrific ProPublica piece from 2011 on the California Commission that shows how Democrats tried to create all kinds of AstroTurf organizations to attempt to influence the work of the commission there. You've seen efforts by both sides to sort of play the Arizona commission. And that might kind of give you a sense of the blueprint and the playbook that both parties use when they're trying to control a process that's really important to them when some of that power has been taken away. I think in Michigan, you're also going to want to follow the money trail. There's going to be lawsuits brought against the constitutionality of this commission. And this lawsuit will probably go all the way to the US Supreme Court, and it could well determine whether or not independent commissions are constitutional. There was a case in the last decade out of Arizona, the AIRC versus Arizona case, that was about the constitutionality of these cases. And forgive me if, Chris, if Michael or somebody else already told this story. But it was a 5-4 court that said independent commissions are constitutional. But of course, it's a very different court now than it was in 2015. And John Roberts wrote the dissent in that case, and it was a stinging, angry dissent. And I do think it's entirely possible that if this case gets back to the court, that commissions could be struck down altogether. So if you live in a commission state, that is something you're going to want to keep an eye on. If you're in Michigan, I think tracking the money of who's backing that will be awfully interesting.
All right, next up, James.
Hey there, this is James Barragan. I'm at the Dallas Morning News, and I've done some coverage of redistricting. I guess for me, the one question I'm trying to get rid of, we spent most of the last decade in court trying to figure out the last maps. And so as we're preparing to cover this round of redistricting, I mean, how should we be preparing to go about it? Like some of my editors are already asking like, hey, what kind of stories can we do? And the only one we've got going right now is like sort of explaining the mess we're kind of in because the census numbers are coming in late. But what things should I be looking at? Should I be looking at some of the districts that were litigated in the last round, or what are some suggestions, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Texas is fascinating because Texas is one of those states where you have partisan gerrymandering, where you've had racial gerrymandering, and where all of this is playing out against a backdrop of demographic change. And so you see the political and representational power of this really clearly. Texas is also where Thomas Hofeller, who was one of the big Republican map makers for many years, did a study of citizen voting age population, which would essentially mean drawing state legislative districts not on the basis of total population, but on the basis of citizen population, which and of citizen voting age population. So you would essentially take anyone who's a non-citizen and anyone under the age of 18 and redistrict based on those numbers instead. And you'd end up with an electorate that is whiter, older, more rural, and in a state like Texas, the use of citizen voting population would be, a very serious change. And that would kick off even more litigation and different litigation. Now it appears that the Biden administration is not going to allow the release of citizen voting population, but a lot of states had been talking potentially about using that instead, and I think that would be a really interesting story to follow. I think taking a look at where these lines are drawn and trying to make the stories real on the ground is a really good way to humanize these stories. You can really see the neighborhoods that people are trying to cut out and to crack and to pack. And I think it's a good way to explain the political power.
Okay, up next we have Stephen Caruso, whose connection is bad, so I'm reading the question for him. Stephen is at the Pennsylvania Capitol Star. Stephen asks, my connection, do you think public awareness about gerrymandering could impact the amount and level of creative mapping we see this year?
Yeah, I do. I mean, gerrymandering was an answer on Jeopardy last night. So it's having a public moment that, I sold Ratf as Gerrymandered Nation, and my publisher said, you can't have the most boring word in the world that puts people to sleep as the title of your book. So they ended up with something quite different. But I think if that book came out now, you could call it Gerrymandered Nation. And my mom could know that I have a book, which would be nice. But it's much more in the public consciousness now. When 59 million Americans live in a state in which one or both chambers of the state legislature is controlled by the party that wins fewer votes, people see it and they get it, they understand it. And so it's going to be harder, I think, for politicians to get away with it. I think the national media is doing a better job of covering voting rights issues than I think happened last time around. The Democrats are fully awake to it this time in a way that they weren't. So sometimes when both political parties are active and engaged, it means that there's more coverage. And yet the danger of all this, right, is that partisan control in most of these places hasn't changed very much. And now the US Supreme Court has essentially ceded the playing field. So politicians are emboldened, and they're going to be able to use technology that has not gotten worse over the course of the last 10 years to draw these lines for another decade. So I think it's an incredibly fraught moment.
All right, we want to get through another 4, 5, or 6 questions. So
I'll go faster.
Thinking 60-second sound bites. This is from Sam Metz of the Associated Press in Nevada. Is it common for Republican groups in Democratic-controlled states to back independent redistricting commissions?
Yes, I think that's often the case. I think there's often a partisan nature of this. Oftentimes, Democrats are much more interested in redistricting in states where Republicans are in charge, and Republicans are more interested in states where Democrats are in charge. I mean, certainly in Nevada, Democrats are not super interested in reform, and they have worked to block a reform. And you don't see Eric Holder talk about Nevada very often. He talks a lot about Wisconsin.
All right, next we'll go to Stella and tell David where you're from.
Hey, this is Stella Yu. I'm a State House reporter at the Nashville Tennessean. And so, yeah, my question is, I wonder if you have specifically looked at Tennessee, especially around metro areas. We have blue islands like Nashville, Memphis, Knoxville. And so, especially around metro areas, what has been, or like what's been some of the GOP strategy when it comes to redistricting focused on metro areas? Because we see these blue islands, but this is where the districts are like the ugliest, where you see a kind of like carving out. And so, yeah, I was wondering if you can talk about the strategies, and also to what extent would there be ground for a lawsuit coming from the Democrats in this case?
I'm always happy to get on the phone and get into any more detail on any of the stuff if there's more questions we don't have time for. I think that, so essentially cracking and packing are the two strategies. And what you want to do when you're packing, especially in urban areas, is just to try to put as many Democratic voters as you can into one district, and they win those districts overwhelmingly. And then it makes all of the other districts in the area, because every line affects every other line. So it pinballs. And you see this in Tennessee's congressional delegation, which I think only has one Democrat. Two, okay, so it's like a 7-2 state, maybe. I forget. It's not a 78% Republican state. So it's very effectively at the congressional level packed the Democratic voters in. If you look, for example, at Michigan, you see a really good example of how this is done. You take Detroit, you draw a wild, crazy district designed to grab as many of the Black neighborhoods in Detroit as well as Pontiac as you possibly can. And then all of the other districts kind of candy swirl off of it. It's like one of those old Willy Wonka lollipops or something as you look at it. And that's kind of how you get it done. You pick and choose and parcel out those voters and then spread them across as many other districts as you can. What Republicans try to do is pack those voters in. What Democrats in Illinois try to do is to draw pizza slices, to use Chicago and attach a piece of Chicago to as many other districts as you possibly can. And that's how Democrats control as much of Illinois as they do. But if you go to Texas, for example, Democrats have the opposite strategy. I'm sorry, Republicans do the same thing, and they take a city like Austin, for example, and you cut that into 4 pizza slices and divide it into 4 Republican districts.
Sorry, one quick follow-up. How does it reflect in terms of like population data? Like if we just look at the population or like voting age, race, composition of like one district, how can we tell that this is how they're packing the district?
Well, the districts have to be equal in population, largely equal in population. So you're not going to see it there. Really, where you're going to see it is in election results. I mean, if you're looking at a packed district, you're looking for the districts that are, 70, 80% one way. And then the kinds of districts that creates around it tend to be a bunch of 55, 58% districts for the other side.
Next we go to Tyler.
I real quickly, I was hoping you might comment on, apparently we're going to see some delays in the census data being released for this. Ohio is a pretty unique case because we have specific deadlines that we're trying to hit that are right around that September mark. I was hoping maybe you could just opine on that and how that might affect us, if there's any way to adjust it, you know.
Yeah, I think this is really concerning. You know, I mean, if these if this data is not available until September, it's going to throw back the process in a lot of states that have statutory requirements on when redistricting has to be done. And then oftentimes there's rules that haven't been used in years. You know, sometimes when these laws are passed, there are consequences that people haven't thought about. And I think a state like Illinois, for example, if the statutes can't be met, then there's a separate commission that comes into play that draws the lines. And that's got Democrats and Republicans on it. And so Republicans in Illinois are really excited that this could happen, and you might miss deadlines because they might have a bigger say in the process as a result. What this also is going to mean is that there's going to be less time for court challenges. And after the US Supreme Court vacated the field, reformers really had a state Supreme Court strategy. And if these maps are going to be drawn, maybe even into next year, there's going to be less time for litigation in states' Supreme Courts, and a better chance that these maps could be enacted and at least one or two cycles run on them in the process.
All right, we're going to go a couple minutes long here, but let's try to get through at least another 3 questions. So tight answers. This is from Ethan DeWitt at the Concord Monitor in New Hampshire. David, you had mentioned that improved technology had made the last redistricting gerrymandering attempts easier to accomplish. Do you know how the technology has changed or improved over the last 10 years? And has it been democratized more now than then?
The people who I've talked to about this recently say that there's not a quantum leap in this, that the real quantum leap came between 2001 and 2011, that the technology is a little bit better, but not so much so that it ought to be a game changer. The game changer that they're waiting for is the advancements of artificial intelligence in the use of creating these algorithms and drawing district lines. And the folks I've talked to on both sides say that they don't think that they've developed that yet, but next time, all bets are off. Has it been more democratized? Yes, absolutely. There are there's the folks at Princeton Gerrymandering, there's Moon Duchin's team at Tufts, there's Redistrictor software, Dave's redistricting software that can put this in the hands of people. And I think it's easier than ever for citizens and average folks, or, in Pennsylvania, they had contests of like high school kids drawing lines, and they drew fairer lines than the politicians. Go figure.
Next question, we have Laura Bischoff from the Dayton Daily News. Ohio changed the rules, but it's still one-party control. Will Ohio still see gerrymandered maps this time around?
Ohio did change the rules, and they made some good changes, but you're right, it's still largely a political process, and Republicans will still dominate it there. There are protections with regards to explicit prohibitions on partisan gerrymandering. So some of the things that Republicans were caught doing last time, they should not technically be allowed to do this time, or they'll have to work a little bit harder to hide those efforts. There's a terrific report that the League of Women Voters did in Ohio in the last cycle called The Elephant in the Room that I really recommend taking a look at if you haven't seen. They got some wonderful details. There are provisions in Ohio about how if you don't get a certain number of Democrats to vote for the maps, that the maps are only in effect, I think, for 4 years and not for 10 years. So there's interesting provisions there that have not been used elsewhere in the country. We'll see what happens.
All right, and 2 final questions. If you two could keep them fairly short, we'll go to Jill and then we'll go to Katie. So Jill.
This is Jill. I am a producer and reporter for a statewide public radio program called the Texas Standard in Austin, Texas. One of the things that we're kind of trying to keep an eye on or trying to figure out how to cover is the number of congressional seats that Texas will pick up after redistricting. And I'm wondering if you could provide more insight of how those seats might look, where, it's Republican controlled. So I imagine, Republicans are going to be drawing these seats, but if there's seats where the population and demographics are changing so drastically, as we've seen in the past couple of elections, I'm just wondering, like, what do they do to work around that? Or what do they do to maintain their control?
This is one of my favorite stories of the last cycle. So Texas is likely to get probably 3 new seats. Right now, every congressional district in the country represents about 711,000 people. The census with population gains, that's going to go to 750, 760 or so. So Texas probably gets an additional 3 seats. Republicans will have complete control of the process. They'll decide where the district lines go, based on those populations. Texas got, I think, 4 new seats in the last cycle. And Republicans are able to draw them in a way that they controlled just about all of those seats. And they did a really risky but advantageous play. They tried to make those districts look like they would be majority minority seats, that they would be largely Latino seats, because that's where the population growth had been. But they cross-referenced all of the voter lists against voter participation and turnout lists. So they tried to draw districts in which they believed they could make it look that it was a majority Latino seat, but that they knew from voter registration and turnout data that those voters simply didn't show up. Now, that puts you in danger if, a Stacey Abrams group arrives and is able to, register and turn those voters out. But it's a pretty sophisticated and sneaky way of drawing the lines.
And final question to Katie.
Hi, yeah, I'm Katie Bernard. I'm the Kansas reporter at the Kansas City Star. What sort of watchdog reporting strategies would you suggest for covering states with that single party veto-proof majority?
Yeah, you're going to have interesting cases in Kansas and in Missouri this year. Kansas is probably certainly going to have a Democratic seat in Congress gerrymandered out over the wish and have that veto sustained by overridden. I think that there's a lot you can do in both those states, right? Missouri also had a fascinating reform effort in 2018 that was then undone in 2020. And so I'm not exactly sure how it's going to unfold in Missouri as a result now. But a lot of this is public. And so I think it starts with really trying to figure out what the transparency rules are in your state. What email do you have access to? What records do you have access to? Who is drawing the lines? What kind of contracts have been created? What kind of consultants have come on? In Wisconsin, the Republicans drawing the lines there hired a political science professor in Oklahoma for tens of thousands of dollars to do a fancy regression study and to determine whether or not these maps would hold even in Democratic years. So I'd be looking for contracts with map makers, with consultants, with universities, and other places where you might be able to sneak some kind of extra insight into what's unfolding behind closed doors.